Labor will support this bill to the Select Committee. Obviously there is some additional work that needs to be done on it, but I would like to acknowledge the Minister for having the discussions that he has had, not only with our party but with all parties in the House, and I think that the approach has been a worthwhile one. As he has identified, one of the concerns that I originally raised was the unfairness of a proposal that did not acknowledge the many New Zealanders who actually want to stay with MMP but who actually don't like some of the issues or some of the practices that have been allowed to develop under MMP. And so to have the opportunity to review some aspects of MMP, should the decision be made to stick with MMP, they will be able to be addressed. So I think that that is a major response, and the government has put this proposal to have really what I've described as a second track post the ballot on whether we wish to stay with MMP or not. If MMP survives that decision, the number one choice on the ballot paper at the forthcoming general election, then they will indeed have the opportunity to look at some of the content of the MMP provisions themselves. Now, I just want to comment on how good it is that that second track is in the bill, and I should say that my preference was to fix it first. I've always been of the view that there are certain elements of the MMP system that should be reviewed after a period of time, because a lot of people made the original decision to change to MMP because they were very angry with two governments, a national government and a Labor government, and it was a plague on both your houses. And they chose the option that actually neither of the leaders of the National Party or the Labor Party at the time wanted at all. Both the leader of the National Party, the then Prime Minister, and indeed the leader of the opposition, the Right Honourable Helen Clark at the time, were very opposed to the MMP option, and both were strong advocates for first past the post. And I think that's what's good about the debate around issues like electoral reform, because essentially, because of the checks and balances in our system, it is the people who will decide the way that they vote their representatives to Parliament. I was giving a speech in Parliament yesterday on another matter, not quite as positive as this one, but I made the point that it's not just a right to vote, there is a duty to be participants in our democratic process, and I believe that this referendum process is one that truly does bring to the fore the fact that it is the voters who will decide, that it is their electoral system, it is our electoral system, and it is something that will be determined by way of referendum. I've made no secret of my position on how I'm going to vote. I'm going to be voting to retain MMP in exactly the same way I voted for MMP originally. Not every political party had a uniform view on this, and that's because it is down to the people to decide. I'm a strong supporter of MMP, and the reason that I'm a supporter of MMP is because it is the only system of proportional representation that is on the ballot paper, the only one. And I think people will have to remember that, and I hope as part of the education campaign that is undertaken that people are given a very clear explanation that even if they look like or sound like a proportional representation, in actual fact they won't be. None of the systems provide a proportional result in the way that MMP does. The scope of the matters that have been set out in the bill for review, I'm hoping that the people of New Zealand do consider these very carefully and make submissions to the Select Committee, because they are not the same. There are different issues within the scope of this review that I think that people should think about very carefully. The first one is the threshold for list seats, the requirement that in order for a party to be eligible for any list seats, they have to achieve either 5% of the total vote, or a candidate has to be elected to an electorate seat. Now, I know that there is a lot of disquiet about this, and I'm going to use the example of two political parties, one that is in Parliament at the moment and one that is not. And that is the example of the ACT Party, where Rodney Hyde won Epsom and in fact was able to bring in the balance of the 3.7% that he won, and New Zealand First, which failed to win an electorate seat with 4.2% of the party vote unable to be represented in Parliament at all. And so the question of the 5% threshold and the question of whether the single candidate winning the seat is sufficient to be a threshold in itself, that is something that should be the subject of debate. I know, because I was on the Select Committee at the time that considered this very issue, that it was a trade-off, that the proposal of the Royal Commission was to have a 4% threshold, and it was decided to lift it at Select Committee to a 5% threshold, and the trade-off was this one seat would enable them to bring in a smaller number than the 5%. They wouldn't have to meet that threshold. And in retrospect, I personally don't think it should have been a trade-off, and I personally don't agree with the coattails provision as I've now come to describe it, because it simply isn't fair on a party that is so close to reaching the threshold but is unable to get any representation in Parliament, where the other gets over-represented in terms of the proportion of the vote they were able to attract. The overhang is obviously one that it doesn't actually cause me any particular bother at all. It sits at 2 at the moment. It has sat at 1. I'm not uncomfortable with the concept of an overhang. It doesn't produce proportionality, which I suppose it offends against the principle of proportionality, but it is quite a good way of ensuring that those that win constituency seats are able to take up those seats in Parliament without losing that entitlement and without over-increasing the size of Parliament. The question of dual candidacy, I have a really strong view about this, and it isn't the one that's kind of implied by this. And I think that people ought to be able to stand for a seat, and they ought to be able to stand for a list as well, for a list position. And the reason is that the list is actually the mechanism by which we fill the number of seats that are left over, as it were, by the proportionality that's applied to the number of votes, party votes that they win, and the number of seats that they win. And to say that a person who stands in a safe national seat should not be allowed to come, a safe national seat shouldn't be allowed to come into Parliament because they weren't able to win that seat as a Labour candidate, is an absolute nonsense. And it would also deprive this House of Paul Quinn and Aaron Gilmore. And I actually don't think that would be fair on Parliament if we were deprived of either of those two individuals. And I could go on through those, but I hope during the Select Committee hearing we have a lot of discussion about the scope of the review, because there are other things that I think should be in the scope of the review that are not in the scope of the review, because there is another issue on the question of the size of seats, and I don't know that we need to have this fixation on an equal number of list seats versus constituency seats, and I think we could do something a little bit better there as well. The final thing that I want to talk about is advertising, and I think it's slightly rich of the Minister to pretend that this is the same environment as it was last decade. And the reason is that we didn't know about the work of the Exclusive Brethren until the 2005 general election campaign. And what we saw there was the effect of unparalleled spending in order to sway the vote against parties, against the Labour Party and against the Green Party in particular. And although you would end up knowing who these people were, having no campaign expenditure limits, it will be a breach of democracy, and we will fight that every step of the way.
Amy Adams. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great privilege, actually, to have the opportunity to take a call on this first reading debate on the electoral